This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. Information at vachamber.com. Virginia hospitals and health systems provide jobs. They support our economy and promote public health. Local hospitals are always open to help people with unexpected health needs. Having a stable healthcare network is vital. Virginia hospitals are our lifeline.
I just received a letter from a student who thanked me for instilling the love of math in him. That's why I teach.
Brought to you by the Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and a very special welcome back to Jeff Schapiro. Glad to have you. Our viewers, I'm sure, now know who you are, and no doubt many of them read you either in print or online in the Richmond Times Dispatch, and you've been covering Virginia for more than 30 years, I believe now. But they also may be seeing you on the video from the newspaper or from WCVE with Craig Carper, or following you on Twitter. And so how do you have time to do all this, Jeff? But you're really staying on top of things, politics, and appreciate an opportunity to talk with you. Initially, about 2017 session now ended, and then we'll venture on out about what lies ahead. So let's hear some of your wisdom about the session that is now history.
Well, thank you for having me, David, and it has nothing to do with ability. It's strictly endurance.
Longevity, yeah.
But, to your rather open-ended question about the 2017 session, I don't think anyone can even begin to consider what the legislature did or didn't without considering the filter through which all of this needs to be evaluated. It's an election year.
Yes.
The House of Delegates will be decided. Virginians will choose a new governor, a new lieutenant governor, and a new attorney general, perhaps. And it's interesting how electoral considerations color the conduct of the legislators, and it's particularly interesting in this sharply gerrymandered universe that is particularly the House of Delegates. All of these districts have been drawn to produce very specific results to either elect conservative Republicans or liberal Democrats, and they come together in Richmond and tend to talk past each other rather than with each other. And so I think that there was a lot of what legislators of an earlier era might call brochure bills. Bills that don't necessarily go anywhere, but they are talking points for the election ahead. And many of those, particularly for legislators on the right, were further restrictions on abortion, broadening of firearms rights. On the left, a lot of Democrats were talking about the Medicaid-financed expansion of Obamacare. Of course, it didn't go anywhere, and that it didn't go anywhere is a powerful talking point for conservative Republicans. But it's also going to be a theme for the gubernatorial campaign. Governor McAuliffe, in every year of his administration, has pushed unsuccessfully for this expansion. I don't think that he was particularly confident that it was going to go anywhere in that reconvened session, but he was, as the lawyers would like to say, perfecting the record by giving the Republicans yet another chance to turn it down, and Democrats yet another chance to advocate for it. And I think that issue perhaps takes on a little greater urgency given the failure of Republicans in Washington to, as they promised, to repeal and replace Obamacare. And one will hear occasionally, even from conservative Republicans, that perhaps the state has missed an opportunity here, at least to bring in some Medicaid money, about $2.4 billion a year. Some Republicans will tell you publicly there's no guarantee the government's good for that money going forward, but more and more of them are saying, well, you know, maybe we should take this money because under whatever changes come out of Washington, we could lose it or lose a lot of it. And if we take what we can, that also loosens pressure on the state budget, freeing up dollars for other priorities, other general fund priorities. So that would be things like law enforcement, education, social services.
As the session was winding down, I mean the reconvene day portion of the session, one of the moderate Republican voices in the Senate, Senator Emmett Hanger, certainly expressed the perspective that we needed to not miss the chance to take this funding and reference some ongoing group of senators and delegates that would be looking at that. I would think that if and when there's some replacement of Obamacare and states are grandfathered in, the 31 or so that have taken that money, it'll certainly be a big talking point and an arguing point about did Virginia miss the chance.
And one of the issues that has come up in regard to the Medicaid debate, not only would Virginia just miss the boat, but if there is some reinvention of the Medicaid system under which Virginia would receive so-called block grants,
right,
kind of large wedges of money that it would have to manage itself, it appears that Virginia would actually get the short shrift under a block grant system. So that is a problem for Republicans as well. It certainly gives Democrats a chance to say, well, we told you so. It's still highly uncertain. There is this entity that the legislature has created to continue monitoring changes in Washington, and I guess change would include the continuing inaction of the Trump administration and the Congress following the failure of that bill in the House. I mean, it was pulled. There were so few votes for it. They couldn't even put it up on the board to vote it up or down. But I am expecting that we're going to be hearing a lot more about that in the campaign ahead. It's a powerful talking point for both parties. It has special resonance within the healthcare community, which sees this big wedge of Washington money as a way to stabilize a lot of hospitals, particularly in the countryside.
Yes.
Lee County, for example, doesn't have a hospital, or it has a vet hospital, but it doesn't have a hospital that serves humans, and that's largely because of what's been going on or not in terms of the healthcare industry. There was a bill adopted by the legislature a year ago that gave the Lee County government the authority to create an entity to reopen one of these hospitals, these now shuttered hospitals, and now that entity is now trying to negotiate some type of operating agreement with one of the healthcare groups in that corner of Appalachia.
Thinking about the effect that perhaps the session might have had or might yet have, I'm thinking now about the primaries that are coming up, and the number of Republican legislators and some Democrats who are facing opposition. I mean, once more, we have someone chairing the Transportation Committee in the House with the Republican opposition. And I say that having seen Joe May around toward the end of the session and knowing how that affects. Have you picked up anything at all about whether there are any of these challenges to, whether it's in the western part of the state, to Delegate Poindexter or to Delegate Moorfield?
In Poindexter's case, the threatened opponent for the Republican nomination didn't qualify. He's going to however, challenge Poindexter as an independent. Scott Lingenfelter, a fairly conservative Republican from the Prince William area, a Richmond native, interestingly enough, will have primary opposition. David Toscano, the minority leader, the head of the Democratic caucus in the House of Delegates, has opposition in his primary. And typically, because of the construction and temperament of the parties, Republican opposition in Republican primaries tends to come from the right.
Right.
In the Democratic primary, the opposition tends to come from the left. I'm not aware at this point of many people who think these incumbents, challenged incumbents, are likely to be denied renomination. But there's a large number of Democratic candidates taking on Republican incumbents. A lot of this is clearly tied to the Trump phenomenon. Remember, Virginia went comfortably for Hillary Clinton. It's the only state in the old Confederacy that supported Clinton over Trump. There's a good deal of concern, anger, and outright agitation among Democrats and a good number of centrist voters over what Trump says he has in mind. And this is spurring an extraordinary number of Democrats to take the plunge and challenge Republicans, many of them in those Republicans in fairly safe districts. So I think what one has to look at now is not how many Republican incumbents are challenged by Democrats, but how many of those Democratic challengers are quality candidates, who have the discipline to run a legislative campaign, who can raise the money to run a legislative campaign, who have the capacity to put together the organization necessary to run a legislative campaign. The quirky system of Virginia elections, off year and off year elections, a lot of that works to the advantage of incumbents because it tends to diminish turnout, and as a result, those who are in office have an advantage, having been on the ballot, knowing who their voters are, knowing how to contact them, knowing how to mobilize them.
I've seen a list floating around, I'm sure that both parties have it, about the number of House districts currently represented by Republicans were carried by Clinton, and I guess
that's 17.
17, and to your point, the voter turnout being different and then than this year would expect
Not
it
only
to be.
the turnout is different, but the composition
Yes.
of the electorate tends to be different. I don't know that many Republicans would dispute that their vote is narrowing in Virginia, that it tends to be older, largely white, heavily male. But these are voters who tend to be the most reliable, who are there year in, year out. And so in those off years when turnout falls, that reliable vote, its strength is magnified.
Now there's some open seats, and comment on some of those and some of the retirements, if you will. I mean, there's some major leadership from the Speaker, the chair of the Courts Committee, among them.
Well, I think Bill Howell's departure, maybe not unexpected. He had considered retiring back in 13. However, with Cuccinelli's defeat, likely he thought it best to stick around. There was also some speculation he might stick around until at least 2019, when the legislature observes its quadricentennial. He is not sticking around, despite his interest in the history of the body he has led for so long. The Speaker's district is one of those that has been a very competitive district at the presidential level. But again, in those off-year turnouts, tends to be reliably Republican. There is a Democrat standing for that seat, a minister. No one seems to be holding their breath that the Democrats will pick up that seat. There's going to be a Republican primary, and one of the candidates in that primary is Susan Stimson, who was a Howell protege who challenged the Speaker in 2015 for the Republican nomination. Other open seats, Jimmy Massey here in the Richmond Henrico area. He is retiring. I think perhaps he tipped his hand back in the fall when he let it be known that he might be interested in running for the U.S. Senate if Tim Kaine's seat had been open, again, had Kaine been elected vice president. I suspect that Jimmy Massey was looking downrange and maybe didn't see too many opportunities in the House, maybe to be the chairman of the Education Committee, not going to happen. To maybe move into a seat as a conferee, a budget writer at appropriations, there was some uncertainty there. A lot of people lining up to run for that seat. Of course, that's also one of the seats that was contested in that failed lawsuit challenging about 11 House and Senate districts as violating the Virginia Constitution. The seat that I would think is a likely pickup for the Democrats is in Northern Virginia. Dave Albo, the chairman of the Courts Committee, that was a surprise. He said he's got to retire because he just can't afford to stay in politics any longer with a young son and a family to support. But as we have seen over the years, Northern Virginia has become a brighter shade of blue. And that could be a tough one for the Democrats to hold. Though, frankly, if I had to guess, had Dave Albo decided to stand for re-election, probably would have held that seat this year.
We were talking some before we started recording the show. Let's bring the subject back up for our viewers, and that is the matter of use of office expense money and so forth. I think before the session, the reconvene day was getting dark. There was a news conference, I believe, held with some of the Republican leadership indicating that under a Governor Gillespie, they would be interested in seeing something changed about where office expense money would be for office and wouldn't be salary. I think the conventional thinking is that most of the legislators do treat it as salary now.
Well, you're referring to the Ed Gillespie rollout of his ethics package, yes. And I suspect that has a lot to do with what's going on in Washington or not, discomfort over Trump. Remember, the last Republican governor was practically in irons, convicted of corruption. That conviction, of course, overturned, but the bad taste that episode left lingers. But to your question, the legislators are paid about $18,000 a year. That's their straight up salary. They also receive $15,000 a year for office expenses. Those dollars are paid directly to the legislators as income. And so, in effect, legislators are being paid about $33,000 a year, since the office allowance paid to them is taxable as income. But it's not something they'd like to talk about. They would rather people believe that they're getting a lot for their $18,000 a year for a senator, $17,640 a year for a delegate. Frankly, if their salaries had kept pace with inflation, they'd be earning about $33,000, $34,000 a year. In an era in which transparency is often advocated, when it comes to their salaries, legislators don't necessarily practice transparency.
When it comes to the campaign funds, in the years that you've been here, you've seen legislators have some difficulty unveiled at times about using those campaign funds in ways that were not, probably not legal, certainly not considered ethical. That seems to be another gray area, at least, about what, use it for your mileage, but not use it to purchase your car, and other questions about that I would think that would cause those legislators seeking to do what's really right to have some questions about what can they use those funds for.
Well, legislators typically will use those political funds to supplement their office expenses. They will use those dollars to operate offices back in the districts. But there is relatively little scrutiny of their spending, though increasingly those dollars or that spending can be monitored online through organizations such as the Virginia Public Access Project, also through the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office in terms of contacts with lobbyists. We get a sense of their assets, their holdings, through their filings that are now available online, typically filed with the clerks of the respective bodies. But it's a big and fairly complex mosaic when one is dealing with 140 souls.
Yes. You've referenced what's happening or not happening on the other side of the Potomac, and I think that many would think that the November election could be somewhat nationalized. Comment, please, on the upcoming primaries and the extent in which you see both Democrats and Republicans, voters who would turn out being influenced by what's happening. I'd love to get you to tell us who's going to win those primaries, but you may be reluctant at this point. But how do you see them being nationalized?
Well, primaries tend to attract the most committed, the most informed voters, activists, if you will, fairly seasoned, mature, regular voters. In this culture these days, those are going to be voters who are very aware, very attuned to what's going on nationally. And those are going to be Republicans who are very excited about what Donald Trump is trying to do or has done. And it's going to include Democrats who are very angry or upset about what Donald Trump is trying to do or has done. But I think we have to kind of maybe look at this from about 50,000 feet, in that Virginia is a state with a population of about 8.5 million. The majority of the people who live in Virginia, just over 50%, 51, 52%, are not from here.
Yes.
So the electorate has become more national in its temperament as the state has grown and as the population has become more diverse. And those party cues, those partisan signals, become increasingly important, even in these state primaries or these local contests. So there's a good deal of linkage taking place within some of these primary races. One sees that with Tom Perriello as the late entry in the Democratic primary, trying to harness rage over Trump against a somewhat more establishment-oriented Democrat in Ralph Northam, who has the support of the kind of the grassroots, the organizational Democrats. On the Republican side, Corey Stewart is running as the Trump sound-alike. Ed Gillespie's trying to strike a balance.
And Jeff, we're going to hold it right there and get you back at least after the primaries.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community. For jobs, the economy, and public health, Virginia Hospitals, our lifeline.
The Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.